According to an article in the Washington Post and author Thomas Edsall, for nearly a decade, Trump has avoided, time and again, the kind of public condemnation that destroys political careers. At the age of 77, he has lost a step. The next 9 months will test what remains of his stamina, agility, and cunning. The kind of scrutiny a presidential campaign brings is just beginning. So, in spite of the fact that Trump receives more attention than is typical of non-presidents, he still has not yet been under the microscope as a presidential candidate to nearly the extent that he will in the coming months. And that will expose his liabilities, including what appear to be his growing cognitive challenges, to a much larger swath of the public.
Jonathan Weiler, a political scientist at the University of North Carolina, put it this way by email. In the 8 presidential elections since 1992, Republicans have only won the popular vote once. The biggest threat to democracy stems from the fact that we have a constitution written by slaveholders who wanted to make it difficult, if not impossible, for slavery ever to be ended by constitutional means. So they gave tremendous powers to a minority of states and voters to block progressive change, which is why we have the Electoral College.
The attitudes and behaviors of Trump supporters and Republicans generally are out of step with those of most Americans. Trump lost in 2020 and the red wave failed to materialize in 2022. Access to abortion has proven to be a major motivator for Democratic and independent voters, and I think awareness of the very real threat to democracy posed by Trump is spreading.
In Massey's view, Trumpism is a cult grounded in fictions that are amplified by his supporters' selective consumption of content on the internet and the broadcast media, which is then intensified by social media. There appears to be no way to penetrate the ideological bubble that Trumpists inhabit, at least as long as Trump is alive and kicking.
Even though many voters are willing to vote for Trump, Enos argued, it's certainly not the case that a majority of voters have normalized Trump. I think when Trump is the nominee, and if and when he is in a real trial on a daily basis, we will see his real vote ceiling, which is below where it is now.
In an email, he wrote, a staff member on the Biden campaign, who refused to be identified because he did not have authority to speak on the record, disputed the notion that voters have normalized Trump.
Voting to protect democracy isn't as straightforward as it may seem. Democracy is an abstraction to many voters. Viktor Orban argues that Hungary is a democracy since there are still regular elections.
Many Trump voters don't think that he's a threat to democracy. To many Republicans, bringing criminal charges against Trump at this point looks like the Biden administration is trying to subvert democracy by getting rid of a candidate who can win in November.
Biden and the Democratic Party will continue to portray Trump as a threat to democracy, but, Feldman warned, these voters, in Feldman's view, want a strong leader who they think will stand up to progressive forces in society that they blame for undermining the white, patriarchal, morally conservative country they believe the United States was and should be. They are not turned off by Trump's extreme, authoritarian rhetoric, they are attracted to it.
It's obvious that Trump has a core group of strong supporters, most of whom are nationalistic and xenophobic. They are frightened by social changes that have been altering American society for the past several decades: immigration, increasing diversity, and the decline of the white Protestant majority, and changes in gender roles, gay and transgender rights, women's rights, etc.
Feldman does not, however, dispute the potential strength of Trump's current presidential campaign. They have a majority in the House and can't pass any legislation. Republican primary voters in a number of states nominate MAGA candidates for statewide office, who then lose the general election because they are too extreme.
Trump is not building a durable, competitive Republican Party. If anything, he is making it more difficult for Republicans to win in a number of states.
Look at the current state of the Republican Party, Feldman continued. A Republican Party that has trouble acknowledging that slavery was the leading cause of the Civil War and talks about deporting millions of undocumented Latinos is not going to be able to make substantial inroads among African American and Latino voters.
There are not that many whites who reject social justice policies and who are not already Republican identifiers. And moving forward, young people are increasingly secular and comfortable with diversity.
They are not going to identify with and vote for a party that also has to court evangelical voters. This is not a stable coalition, Feldman wrote by email. Stanley Feldman, a political scientist at Stony Brook University, shared Rudolph's doubts about the viability of a post-Trump Republican Party with MAGA voters at its core.
Has Trump created a broad and enduring Republican coalition out of MAGA supporters, added backing from Republicans hostile to Democrats, a scattering of minority voters as well as white independents and Democrats who reject liberal social justice policies? In fact, Hetherington continued, Trump in 2020 lost the same percentage of Republicans as Ronald Reagan did in 1984 to 6%. Our analysis suggests that Republicans so deeply dislike the Democratic Party now that they'll still support candidates with whom they deeply disagree on even the most important political matters.
Many Republicans who reject some of Trump's policies still view him as an acceptable presidential candidate and will pull the Trump lever on Election Day, according to Mark Hetherington, a political scientist at the University of North Carolina. There are a variety of factors holding together the disparate factions in the Republican coalition.
It splits the Democrats, and the border mess feeds into the narrative that Biden is not up to the job. Crime, too, to a lesser extent, though that may be fading.
As issues, they don't outweigh abortion and maintaining democracy among Democrats and moderate independents, but Trump-leaning Republicans and independents simply don't see Trump as a threat to democracy. Jacobson cited the divisive power of the issue of immigration.
Clearly, yes. He's running neck and neck with Biden _X000D _X000D in the horse race polls and has very strong support among about two-thirds of ordinary Republicans.
His normalization is reflected as well as a consequence of the majority of Republican politicians who endorse him despite all. Examples are nearly all his rivals for the nomination, and polls like McConnell, who may despise him but nonetheless say they will vote for him if he is nominated. Jacobson's emailed reply. In this context, I asked Gary Jacobson, a political scientist at the University of California, San Diego, whether a majority of the electorate had normalized Trump, and whether enough voters have granted him political legitimacy to make him a fully competitive presidential candidate.
We have long understood that Republican and Democratic partisans increasingly live in alternate universes, with less and less in common. This separation of Democrats has, in turn, facilitated Trump's efforts to turn the Republican Party into a truth-denying sect. In addition, they found that a non-trivial share of American electorate currently views the Democratic Party as non-white and the Republican Party as white, though in reality whites continue to be a majority of both parties.
In their April 2022 paper, The Origins and Consequences of Racialized Schemas About U.S. Parties, Kirill Zhirkov and Nicholas A. Valentino, political scientists at the University of Virginia and the University of Michigan, wrote that, overall, our results show that American parties are increasingly seen as distinct racial and ethnic camps rather than institutions for delivering unique policy bundles, and this has major implications for understanding current political processes in the United States. It would be difficult to overestimate the role of racial animosity in the evolution of the two parties since the mid-1960s, a development that most recently found expression in Trump's domination of the Republican Party.
Race and immigration, Hatchnell added, are core issues that are not only undermining Biden's candidacy, but are also threatening the success of the Democratic Party. Racial issues and those involving immigration are crucial to Trump's continued level of support.
While many of the positions that Trump is taking and the rhetoric that he is using on these issues may appear extreme to objective observers, Zoltan Hajnal, a political scientist at the University of California, San Diego, wrote by email, public opinion data suggest that much of America believes in much of what Trump is selling on race and immigration.
Results from the Iowa caucuses last week and Tuesday's New Hampshire primary reaffirmed Trump's strong backing among Republican voters. It's the first time in 40 years that the same Republican candidate won both states, when Ronald Reagan ran virtually unopposed.
Polling on a Trump versus Biden rematch in the fall demonstrates that, at least so far, Trump's extremist behavior has failed to destroy his chances in November.
Now let's hear from the eager listeners of this channel. How about a few comments? And please, don't hold back.
I think Douglas Massey put his finger on the real problem here, the Electoral College. Trump lost the popular vote in 2016 by a far larger margin than Nixon did to JFK in 1960 and by twice as much in 2020. If we had a true democracy, Trump would be a washed-up reality show host right now fighting to stay out of prison.
Deep down, they may believe that Trump and the Republican Party will protect them.
And if Donald Trump loses the election yet again, he and his followers will claim voter fraud, he will pressure state election official, etc. Rinse and repeat. That is why the courts need to pick up speed, reject his trying to slow-walk his cases and convict him of all the serious offenses he's been indicted for.
Thank you and thank you again. It is about time a Times editorial writer discussed the real reasons underlying Trumpism and spoke out against the normalization of his status and policies. Both those who support him and those who are determined to prevent him from being elected know what he stands for and why he is so popular. Unless we are willing to accept claims that MAGA supporters represent normal American attitudes, Trump cannot be treated as a normal candidate. He must be denounced again and again.
In the 8 presidential elections since 1992, Republicans have only won the popular vote once. The biggest threat to democracy stems from the fact that we have a constitution written by slaveholders who wanted to make it difficult, if not impossible, for slavery ever to be ended by constitutional means, so they gave tremendous powers to a minority of states and voters to block progressive change, which is why we have the Electoral College. The Republican Party is the minority rule, anti-democratic party. It's also the party of oligarchy, dollarocracy, kakistocracy, theocracy and idiocracy. They literally have no platform besides tax cuts for millionaires and Bibles, guns, flags, milky white skin, spite, xenophobia and ill will toward others, for everyone else. There's no there to the Republican Party except for surfing the fumes of minority mob rule to feed the rich. The majority needs to show up in historic supermajority numbers to defeat minority Republican rule. That's the undemocratic American system. The country has never been a democracy or anything close to it, and Republicans use the constitutional electoral college and Senate poison pills to wreak absolute minority rule havoc on public policy and to rig the judiciary that validates awful Republican public policy. It's not a good system or a fair one or a democratic one. And the only way to overcome it is to wake up and vote Democratic in huge numbers. Stop voting for the grand oligarch party.
Too many Republicans and media pundits have never stopped normalizing Trump. The ones who profess they are not Trump supporters are the worst of all. These pundits say Trump is unacceptable while simultaneously criticizing Biden-Harris, providing quasi-rational excuses to vote for Trump. You can tell when they critique or offer advice to Biden when, factually, the issue or problem is Congress's responsibility, such as immigration reform, border security, or the national debt. The logical math is as follows in a binary choice. Misleading attacks on Biden equal rationale to vote for Trump. These pundits may be unwitting, but they are too consistent in their methods for that to be plausible.
I'm a minority in this country, and I must admit that since Trump started running back in 15 or 16, I have felt that the US is a country I live in and not my country, even though I was born here. This country has become tremendously radicalized, and it is clear that at least half the country despises people in my community.
I appreciate the contrast in opinions by the political experts in this article. The end of the article hints at a problem that I have found troubling with voters, or maybe it's just with the media's reporting. Somehow, despite Biden and Trump being only 3 years apart in age, voters seem to think Biden is too old to be president and Trump is not. By that logic, people should only marry spouses of exactly the same age. There's something cognitively wrong with the candidates? There's something cognitively wrong with a majority of voters if they think that 3 years makes any difference at an average age of 80. Yet I see this argument against Biden more than any other.
Even if Trump is able to put together such a coalition and win the election, that does not necessarily mean that it will provide the basis of an enduring Republican coalition that will outlive Trump. How can so many expert commentators continue to ignore the obvious? Trump has made it perfectly clear that if he is re-elected, there won't be any more political parties as we know them. Because there won't be any more elections, what is it about the fragility of our democratic system and the terrifying threat of the MAGA movement that the pundits, spinning their political prayer wheels, just can't quite grasp?
Having been born during World War II, I witnessed and took part in the changing culture of the 1960s. Major changes which arose from the founders' belief that all men are created equal, noted well by Heather Cox Richardson in her book, Democracy Awakening.